Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever we are. I'm Martin Raybarts, Director of New Zealand International Film Festival, Whānau Marama, the Family of Light, as we call it. I'm really pleased to today be here speaking to a number of New Zealand filmmakers and people who were around the making of those films that are part of this cooperation between the Dharamshala International Film Festival, run by Ritu Sarin and her husband Tenzing, who's have been running the Dharamshala International Film Festival since 2012 as a space in the Himalaya region in India, promoting international quality cinema, which is very much what New Zealand International Film Festival does in our remote region of the world, New Zealand. Really pleased to be, this is an incentive also put together by the New Zealand High Commission in Delhi. So we're really grateful to them for helping expedite this, and also the New Zealand Film Commission, who've been part of bringing us all here together. I would like to introduce our esteemed guests now, and I think probably the best way to do that is, I'm looking at my screen, I will go from left to right and just keep it simply geographical. We have Ainsley Gardner, who's one of the co-directors of the film Cousins. We have Briar Grace Smith, one of the directors and cast members, a wonderful cast member of the film Cousins. Briar thought she'll not just help write and direct a movie, but also star in it. Well done, good choice, Briar. And as it was. And we have Anna Marbrook here. Anna, welcome. We'll be coming back to you in a moment, and we'll be talking about your wonderful film about your incredible female navigator. And we have with us your female navigator's sister, Fetawe Ayosefo. So we'll be speaking to some of the makers of these films, and also, as I said, some of the whānau and family who were around the making of these films. Let me see. I think one of the things that this is about Indigenous filmmaking. Is there a way that one of you or each of you would like to speak to how you see Indigenous filmmaking? Because I think it's one of the most, or what that would be. What do we call that? Because it's one of the most interesting questions I think all of us in the community are delving into and grappling with. And I think we have some great examples in this Zoom meeting of how you approach story from the Indigenous world. Anna, in your case, whether you're from that world or not, but being invited in. So I think there's so many interesting questions which occur all over the world, and these will be questions that will be relevant to our Indian, certainly to our Indian filmmaker audience as well. Ainsley.
Darn it, Martin. You started with a very big question.
Well, I think we could deal with these. Sorry, I just think I didn't mean to it is a big question, I realize that, but let's deal with it in sort of small personal bites.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a question that I've been asked, and I've contemplated my whole kind of filmmaking career, and I do take it as a small personal bite all of the time. What is important to me? What are the stories that inform my perception of myself and my perception of my community? And I also come to filmmaking, I think, as a service person. How can I serve my community by reflecting images of them, of us, that potentially more authentic than some of the images they've seen previously. So it's such a massive question, but from a personal perspective, I just want to tell stories about who I am, where I come from, to the people who identify with the same stories.
Before I move on, is there, that's absolutely clear and important, because we come from underrepresented, from communities that have not necessarily always found themselves on screen represented and their stories told. Is there a desire in you that this work speaks, and obviously there is, but maybe talk about it a little bit, to people beyond those communities, internationally, for example?
I think as a filmmaker, I almost never think of that. And that's not a very good admission for a producer, but maybe for a director, it's okay. I only really think of it in terms of where am I in this story? And therefore, how can I be part of making this story feel like an authentic experience? And does it speak authentically to a particular community? I think that naturally makes a film far more resonant internationally. So while I may not necessarily be targeting that, I am aware that by making a really authentic, truthful perspective of a story, it will somehow be kind of more resonant with a greater audience, I think.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, the specific, the more specific, the universal is a truth wherever the story is coming from. I'm just going to move around my screen to Brian, in which, from my point of view, you're next. Brian, what is your, you know, sort of summary idea of Indigenous filmmaking? And you've also been engaged with other films, Indigenous works outside of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Australia, and Native American stories in North America. What's your point of view?
I think, well, every experience has been different. And I think a word that always comes to me when I'm working on an Indigenous film as a writer or as a director more recently is the word community. So a way to tell a story that involves and celebrates community and the way we as Indigenous people operate within that. And for me, to talk about script, because it's something that I guess it's something I can talk more specifically about, was the novel of Cousins was written in a very, it was a kind of a spiral way of telling stories, a kind of gathering of community. There was no one perspective. It just kept growing and growing and growing. And it was also very non-linear. So we stood in the present, but to make sense of the present and that character, we flipped back and forth and around through time and then came back. And of course, the present and what the message was far more poignant. And that is a very Indigenous way of telling a story. And it's not a way that film, that we're encouraged to tell stories in that way. We usually follow a very Hollywood or Western framework in terms. And so for Ainsley and I, it was very important that we tell that story in that way. And so that was wonderful for me. And what I came to realize was that instinctively, I am, as a writer, drawn to that anyway. So my natural impulses have always been to tell stories that way, because that's how we tell them when we stand to speak. So, yeah.
Those are two beautiful things, that the non-linearity of Indigenous storytelling, and also the idea of community and the collectivity of the making of the work. I really want to come back to those things. And speak of collectivity, going to Anna, in your film, you collaborated so closely with the family of your subject. You became part of that whānau for a period of time, I would guess. How did that collectivity come about? Because you met your main character on another project where she was involved in her great craft as a navigator of ocean-going waka, which are, for the listeners, those are great ocean-going Pacific canoes. How did you create that collectivity, which was a very personal one inside a family?
So yeah, I mean, the friendship with Emma came first. That was sort of the primary thing. We had a friendship over a number of years before the film even was sort of embarked on. Oops, she's back. So I think there was a level of trust to begin with that was really significant, and a friendship, a really good friendship. I don't think I would have embarked on a film like Loimata without that. So that was kind of central. That was central to it. I think relationships for me as a, Pākehā white New Zealander working across that space, the most important thing for me is relationships and process. So if there are those relationships in place that are not just, in this case, the family, it was the whole structure around a film. And then on top of that, what's the process that we go through in the making of the documentary? How do we, at each point, talk? How do we develop the work together? What are they open to sharing? So, and then even taking that through into the edit process, giving the family that right of say in the edit. So opening that up, and not just sort of one viewing over a number of months, and then opening that up to the broader community. So there was a whole process around that in terms of making the film. Right. And I think too, stepping into that space, Emma had seen me work for a number of years across the, with voyages and making work about voyaging, and seen me on waka and seen me sailing and badly, and had kind of experienced me. And it's quite an intimate space when you're actually on those voyaging canoes together. You really get to see what someone's made of. So I think she probably sussed me out. Fatoe will let you know more about that, but I think she kind of sussed me out before we stepped into it.
In our work, you were talking about something in the middle of that, the ongoing consultancy with the subject of your documentary, the subjects of your documentary. That opening your storytelling up to, if you like, the tribe or the iwi or the community it represents. That's not always the natural process of a Western style documentary. So I would argue that consultivity is also part of an Indigenous telling. What Ainsley, Briar, what do you think about that when you're writing scripts, or Ainsley when you're producing or directing? How much more consultative do you think we need to be as Indigenous makers?
Yeah, I think it's what Anna's saying about relationship, to be honest, and what Briar's already said about community, and sort of it is a consultative process, but actually that's not the most effective word to describe it. It is partnership, it is true collaboration. So I think any Indigenous process, and whatever part you play in it, is actually about, as Anna has said, it's about process, or tikanga. It's about following the process that is naturally occurring within the story or the community or the tribe that you want to tell. So I think it is really going beyond consultation to true collaboration and partnership is probably the nature of Indigenous storytelling for both doco and drama.
The depth of the DNA of making work within an Indigenous process is absolutely within the community. It's more than consulting, and it's more than collaboration. It's sort of deeply embedded.
There was a moment that Fatoe may tell you about when we were on a small island called Upalima, and this is the families, which you see in the film. You see the families kind of return home after many years, and some of the family have never been there. And when we were there, which you don't see on camera, Fatoe's mother introduced me as her daughter. And you could see everyone there looking at me like, that's not right.
How did that happen? Yeah.
Where did she come from?
Briar, you had particular access to the author of the original book, because that's a family member of yours, which people watching this may not be aware of. You're part of the of the author's family. Did you have a kind of check-in process, or was it something formal or informal with both you and Ainsley as you were making this work with the originator of the work?
Well, it's been interesting because, as you know, Mera Tamita, who was one of our most esteemed, for a long time, the only Māori woman writer-director who had made a feature film. She was originally going to make Cousins, and over the space of about 20 years, worked on and off with Patricia. And I was then Patricia's daughter-in-law. And so I was often there making cups of tea or in the background. So I could hear, I never read the scripts, but I could hear the difficulties that they were having in the adaptation of the script. And I was kind of privy to a lot of the talk. And so in the writing of the book, I believe that it was a fairly easy adaptation, considering it should have been, and usually is, a lot harder. I just feel like some of the things they talked to, I retained. And I also knew to be very brutal in the first draft in terms of what material I used and what characters I used, because they had a lot of their challenges were all around distillation and making things smaller. And then Patricia, the book's author, came on board as a script advisor. So she was reading drafts, and her and I would meet again for a cup of tea, and she'd give her feedback. And it was incredible because she had a different life with that book. So, and she had lived in the time when it was made, those stories were written. So she was able to give me so much more context than was even in the book. And it was just a feeling that I was able to, I guess, an energy more than anything. Not everything went into the adaptation or the screenplay, but I just felt I could feel I had knowledge from her that I brought into the writing that made a difference.
And interestingly, you said you'd been hearing about this story being adapted to a film over 20 years ago, and it was, you know, that time when it was in Merita Mita's hands. But what I took from what you just said is that you had a sense of ownership of the story. It was given to you in a way. It was like, here is my treasure, as we say in Te Reo Māori, my taonga. It's yours to make the film from. Fetue, you're back. Welcome. It was really wonderful hearing from you about this process of taking the film in its pieces and the story and presenting it to a council of advisors within your family and community. That was really wonderful to hear that. Could you just pick that up?
Yeah, sure. So everything that Anna and Jim did, we or thought of, we did it together. And then if we had a core of advisors, cultural advisors also, that we would go and speak to. But we've also got an Ainga Ethics, which is our own family ethics committee. So when any of us are writing or publishing or whatever, everything that we do goes through this committee. So this film was no different. Everything had to go through this process. And we were really blessed because Anna and Jim were so open to this way of doing things. And they were just, but like Jim was like an uncle to my son. So he was Joshua's lecturer at AUT, and Anna and Fatty, they were really tight. So like it had to be a family that was that was doing this film with us, because we're so family orientated. And so, it was really beautiful. And it was so beautiful that Anna and Jim were both accommodating to our ways of knowing and being, and it wasn't an easy road, poor Anna. But, the love is good. The love is good. So, and mum and dad, Anna is like their little white daughter. She announced it at Apulima and said, and this here is my daughter. And everyone's like, yeah, okay. So it was awesome. So we see them as family. And I think, I'm not sure how the film industry works, but I know how we work. We couldn't work with anyone that didn't feel like part of our family. And so,
Thank you. That's beautiful to share that. And I think, when it's at its very best, the film industry can work like that. I think we've probably all worked on films where it's had that feeling, but it's not always a guarantee. But what a beautiful, unique way. And Anna, do you have something more to add to that? The question of being part of that family, and how you and Jim as Pakeha, European outsiders, as it were, handled that, because you were just sort of complimented for doing it, but I can't imagine you'd want to do it any other way, knowing you a bit.
Yeah, I think probably Jim and I have worked in similar ways in the past in separate projects.
We're speaking of Jim Marbrook, Anna's brother, who was the producer on this film, is also a filmmaker himself.
Yeah, I think, you know, when he made the documentary Dark Horse, which later became a feature film, I know that grew out of his deep friendship with Genesis, the lead character of that film. So I think if you look at it sort of, you know, that's the core thing that runs through everything, are those relationships. You know, it was when we first kind of started filming, you know, I remember Emma saying, I'll come along to a small family gathering, and there was like 120 people there. And I was going, okay, this is going to be, you know, documentaries often so lean, you know, so.
There's something in that I want to raise, which is about decolonization, which you know, a couple of you mentioned, and how telling our stories is a kind of healing process for and contributes to a decolonization. I'm sure Patricia's original novel had a great deal of that in it, in the story of the book Cousins, which Ainsley and Breyer have adapted so beautifully. Certainly the very personal storytelling that occurs in Anna, your film, with Emma and Fetwe, your family. How much, you know, are our stories a kind of communal therapy for the past, like freeing ourselves of the past, whether it be a colonial past or a personal past? How effective is it, do you think?
I just wanted to pick up somewhat on that and what Anna was saying about the documentary having a life of its own. And I think that's one of the characteristics of Indigenous storytelling, is that stories are living, breathing things that, particularly in the tradition of oral storytelling, that transform through every telling. And like with Cousins, it was a similar process. It transformed from the book to Breyer's adaptation, to Breyer and my interpretation, but then also it transformed when we set it in Ngāti Pikiau in Te Arawa, in the region, the tribal region where we shot it, that hapu, that sub-tribe, then breathed its life into the story and brought its perspective. And so I think that's kind of characteristic of it. And the decolonization part of that, I suppose, is that we have, as well as all of the aspects of decolonization in our politics and our structures and our education system and that sort of thing, the stories that we've received are a kind of egotistical, usually a kind of hero's journey, conflict-based kind of storytelling, where there usually is one director who says, this is the story I want to tell, and this is how I want to tell it. Whereas you hear Anna talking about it, and Breyer and I will talk about it in ways that we didn't think of the film in that way. It has a life of its own, and we are some of the people who will guide this version of this story into the world, I suppose.
Guiding into the story into the world is a really beautiful phrase. It again sort of takes away that sort of sense of unique ownership, but it is carrying something. Breyer, I pointed out when I introduced you, and I think it's interesting with an Indian listeners who will be hearing us. You are a screenwriter, a theatre maker, an actress, a director, and in some part producer of all of those things as well, of course. For us in a Western context, and New Zealand, Aotearoa, is a Western context, is different than the way approaching storytelling is in India. You'll quite often in India find people playing a multiplicity of roles in the same way. So what I described of you as this sort of Renaissance, multi-gifted, multifaceted character, an Indian listener or viewer would just go, yeah, and? Do you feel that is that a personal thing for you, or is maybe that's part of an indigeneity as well? That you felt comfortable to take on those different roles? Ainsley also, producer, director, writer.
I have a thing about storytelling because I also write in many mediums. I also write prose and poetry, and I have a thing about storytelling. It's just another way to tell a story. It's so I feel there's a fluidity in the way we tell stories. So I don't think it's either that much of a huge deal. It feels different with every approach, but it's just a matter of doing a bit of a switch. So directing compared to acting feels very insular and you're very inside a character, whereas directing you're very, you're out in the big world, with a broader perspective of what's going on. But in terms of the acting, because I came from a base of theatre and I was an actor, in this case, Nancy Brunning, who was one of our most esteemed, incredible actors, was supposed to have the role I ended up playing of older Makareta, and she became very ill. She had cancer, and about 2 weeks we were just out of shoot, 2 weeks before shoot, she became too ill to be able to take the role on, and we all decided, and it was very hard because no one wanted to let go. Nancy didn't want to let go either, to let the idea of her playing that role go. So it became a kind of a question of me kind of stepping up because we were just 2 weeks away. But it was funny, I didn't intend to. I just said I should audition, and next minute there was a tap on the shoulder and the casting director was there with a camera, and I had to audition. And Ainsley and I always joke about this because she made me audition, and in the end, after being reluctant in terms of taking on that role, I began to really fight for it. Yeah,
You did.
I'm so glad you did. It's a really wonderful role. Actually, that brings me to just another point. There was, as you were talking about the adaptation, and there was so many layers and interwoven stories, like literally like a braid of three different, the cousins of the titular cousins. The choices you made to pare that down and have one as the backbone of the telling. That must have been heartbreaking because the material is so rich, and in terms of a history of our colonization and moving towards decolonization, there's so much meaty, great stuff of the history of Maori women in particular in Aotearoa. Was it heartbreaking? Did you ever say, let's stop and get like 5 hours from Netflix and make a mini series because the characters and the stories are so good?
I think at the very beginning, we talked about making that it could be possibly a longer show. We talked about our options, that it could be, a mini series, 6-part mini series. We talked about all of that, but then made a really conscious decision to make a feature film. But I know at one stage, Gayleen Preston was going to adapt it as a director, and she was quite strong, I think, on doing, a 6-part drama series at one point or something, because there is so much material in it. But I read the book 3 times back to back, and then I wrote down what I remembered. And sometimes it was just imagery. And Ainsley always talks about the marble. There's a marble that is in the story, a coloured marble that keeps showing up. And it was an image that struck both Ainsley and myself. So that became a kind of a thread throughout the story. So it was things like that, and then tying them all together and truncating and merging characters.
No, it's beautifully crafted. The adaptation is incredibly well crafted, and does that I suppose that you leaves you wanting more. So,
What you're saying, Martin, is that that thing about is it heartbreaking? In a way, no, because I think one of the troubles with being an Indigenous storyteller is that you do have quite a weight of responsibility on you, and in one film we can't possibly right the wrongs. so actually to really be able to just focus on to the really key important parts was quite luxurious, actually, to just be able to say, we don't have to tell every story. We just want to tell this little thing. And Briar and Patricia do a great job in the novel and in the film of adding all of these other strands of historical context and kind of political and social kind of commentary, but actually, yeah, some kids in a marble and some great memories that last a lifetime. You know, it's freeing to be able to just tell
Distill
a
it.
little part of your story. We just have to be able to make many, many more in order to cover all of the other stories you're talking about.
Absolutely, and that was actually my I guess my last question, because our time is ticking. We're running out of the time we have together, but you know, it's known it's hard to make stories about people who are brown, people who are outside, people whose stories don't naturally fit into the linear classic Hollywood hero's journey, and each of these films that we're talking about grappled with those issues. And congratulations to all of you. Congratulations to Merita before you also on Cousins, who struggled to get that up, even as our most notable Māori filmmaker, female filmmaker. Is it getting any easier? Do we, you know, does each success make the next step easier, or is it, you know, it's not that any of you are going to have the answer to that. Maybe just how does it feel to you?
Yeah, I don't know if it gets easier. I've had a very blessed career and been able to do a lot. And each time it is really difficult to get anything happening. And that's maybe even less to do with some of the stuff we're talking about tonight, and just to do with the availability of resource and the kind of how it is in New Zealand making films and that sort of thing. But I feel like the most important thing, and I imagine for Toi and Anna feel the same about this, but to be able to inspire another kind of generation to realize how many stories we have to tell and how beautiful these stories are and how important it is to tell them. I think that's a big part of the process. You know, Brian and I often talk about the fact that prior to Cousins, we hadn't seen that many films that had Māori women as the protagonists. They were certainly there in the films, but they weren't the protagonists. So we feel, you know, we've been able to kind of take a step forward in terms of, I suppose, representation, visibility, you know, reversing erasure and decolonizing the screen.
And may I add the commercial success, the audiences flocked to this film. You know, and so you proved a commercial point, a business point as well. And I think, Anna, your film was also very, very well received. Certainly, I know through the festival it was selling out all over the place. So, you know, I think that's another, you know, thanks to the films you've all made, that's shifting one of the key nuts and bolts paradigm, which is, you know, films with brown women don't make money, and you've just disproved that. Boom, boom, which is great.
It was, you know, I'm reflecting on my kind of life in this country. I've lived in this country quite a lot. I mean, I've lived away a bit as well, and I think I guess what was really significant for me was the work of Merata Mita. I think that was corresponded with seeing her film of Bastion Point, of Patu, of Mauri, of the film she made about the building of Mangere Bridge. Those films for me came at a point in my life, you know, in the 80s, when I was, I guess, trying to decolonize my lens, you know, and those films were incredibly provocative for that. And then the likes of Barry Barclay, you know, the beautiful films that he made. I still remember watching Ngāti, you know, that was just an astounding thing for me, because I guess it just, they were views into worlds that we don't always get to see, and they were works that were told with great kind of heart. So for me, they were critical and part of my grappling to decolonize myself. And I think that process continues. You know, I think the one mantra to myself is don't take anything for granted. You know, question everything, question the way I'm seeing things. And what was wonderful about working on Loimata, you know, Emma's so, and the family, you know, this is a family of kind of great thinkers and contributors and philosophers and activists. So, you know, there was this very rich dialogue where I'm getting the opportunity to check out what I'm seeing. Is that how I'm seeing it? Is that right? Or is there something deeper that I'm missing? Because if I can't listen to that, then I can't tell the story in a way that resonates to the communities it's speaking to. And also I think even resonates universally, because I think if you can really listen to those deep things, they mightn't all be visible or understandable to a viewer, but they'll feel something quite deeply in those moments on screen. So yeah, I guess that decolonization process, for me, it continues, and I'm sure it will continue until my last breath, you know, is questioning that. And I think that's the beautiful benefit of living in a country like, you know, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's just such a vibrant and dynamic place.
I've got a list of the films that will be part of the Indian you know, reflection of Indigenous stories, which is a much more complex story than ours, ours is quite sort of black and white in a way. We've been colonized. Maori Pacific people are in a minority, and the colonial powers are the ones who are in the majority. In India, it's a much more complex place, and you have domination of language or domination of particular, certainly in cinema, the domination of Bollywood and you know, cinema from the Malayalam cinema and Telugu cinema. These are all big, bold, overwhelming industries in India that don't leave much space for stories that might come from minority communities. So the films that will be playing opposite your films in India really reflect minority community points of view, because in India everyone is brown and everyone looks sort of quite similar at first glance. So it's a different kind of decolonization, and it's, I think about and the overwhelming dominance of certain majorities, I suppose, that India is grappling with in some really interesting ways. My Name is Salt by Farida Pasha, Lady of the Lake by Pavan Kumar, and The Shepherdess of the Glaciers by Stanson Dorjaigia and Christian Madule, which again, I think is a film made with someone from outside of India, but with a particular point of view and welcomed in. So a little bit like yours, if you like, Anna. Just to wind this up, Fetoe, you were talking about the experience of making this film with Anna and your family's engagement and your ethics committee. Do you see more films coming out of the family directly, whether Anna and Jim are involved or not? Because you clearly, you know, have the heart of storytelling filmmakers is in you from the work that you co-made with Anna and Jim.
Well, there was so much footage, right, Anna? And poor Anna and Jim, they had to, like, there is so much there. And I think there is so much there in the essence of recentering family, as the family, they're the ones, like, you know, I think we've been overlooked, like whānau aren't whānau are looked upon as a problem, but actually the whānau has the solutions. You just have to give us a chance to do it. And I think there's so much footage in there that you know, it could possibly work. But I just wanted to touch on Emma for this film with Anna. She like crossed all boundaries. She was a 6'2" large woman, and she was LGBTQI, part of that community. So in the whole indigenizing it, this was all part of the norm. This was her norm. And so that's not a norm for very many Pasifika people, but for us, it's our norm as well. And that was something that Anna openly took on. So we're real grateful to yeah, just to have that connection. If we didn't feel the connection with Anna and Jim and see them as family, as well as the sound people and the whole crew, there's no way we would have done it. You know, so yeah, it'll be awesome if whatever happens, you know, what matters is food, right, Martin? So we'll get together and eat over food and talk about stuff. But who knows where to from here. But what I do know for sure is that this message of Loimata has to be seen. It is a family healing family, and we need more of that globally.
And this is, you know, this is part of that global presentation of all those ideas of family and how healing can come about to India. Look, thank you all for being here, all in your different time zones. And I just wanted to remind the Indian viewers that the wonderful forerunner of these films in many, many ways, Merita Mita, you will see a film in this collection called Merita, or How Mum Decolonized the Screen, by Hepere Mita. So all of the mentions of Merita, which just naturally came out of these conversations, you have the great luck to be able to watch a beautiful documentary, which is a portrait of this powerful, powerful woman who was not just behind an earlier version of Cousins, but also behind, I think, the hearts of the filmmakers who are here with us all today. So look, thank you all, and thank you, Merita, and thank you, Emma, for everything they've given us all. And thank you for sharing this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.